Well, good morning again. If I were to ask you to think about what is the good life, what would be going in your mind or through your mind? I'm guessing it wouldn't be the textbook definition. You wouldn't be going back to Philosophy 101. What did Aristotle say about the good life? I imagine that what's happening is that images are flooding your mind about what the good life looks like. And these images come from past experiences, or maybe they're images that you have seen on social media. Well, this morning, James wants us to consider the good life. And so I'm going to invite Braden to come up and read for us this morning's text found in James 3.
Good morning and happy Father's Day. Yes, I'll be reading from James chapter 3, NIV version. Last time Paul asked me to speak, I read from King James. I was asked to read from NIV. All right. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. Thanks.
Thank you, Braden, the word of the Lord. So did you hear that? James says, who is wise and understanding among you? Let them consider it by showing their good life. And so like I was saying, what do we think about? What are those images that come to our minds? Well, this one gives us all these images off the Welcome PEI Instagram account. The good life is sipping wine or coffee at sunrise or sunset, a fresh bowl of mussels, or my favorite, kayaking out on the ocean. This is the good life, as the world will tell us. But there's something about that. There's something about this. James is telling us to consider the good life, and there's something troubling about this because it kind of smells of self-indulgence. We worry that maybe that's problematic because it seems very self-centered. And we've said this before. We know that God delights in us delighting in good things, but there's a problem. There's a problem if these things become absorbed into our bones, if we begin to make them our end goal and we harbor envy when we don't get them. We realize that. We realize that this is the problem, isn't it? And James says, when that happens, we are not living wisely. Or perhaps what he says is, you're living by the world's wisdom. You're living by earthly wisdom. In James 15, verse 15, he says that such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. And when you hear that line, such wisdom does not come down from heaven, your mind should go back to the verse that we memorized and looked at a few weeks ago in James chapter 1. What does come down from heaven? James 1, verse 17. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. It's the good things of the world that God is giving us. These are the things that come down from heaven. And what James is warning us is that earthly wisdom, and he gives us three adjectives to describe it. He describes this earthly wisdom as being earthly. He describes it as unspiritual, and he describes it as demonic. So in other words, it's wisdom that comes not from God, but from the earth. It comes from humans. It's wisdom that is void of the presence of the Holy Spirit. It's not Spirit-infused. And it's wisdom that, again, not coming from God, but is actually coming from the deceiver, from the evil one. It is demonic in that sense. And this is the warning that James is giving us. When we sell out to this earthly wisdom, this is what we're selling out to. In short, we might say, that a life of envy and selfish pursuit shuts God out and is inspired by the enemy, the evil one. Now, the trouble is we make certain assumptions about earthly wisdom, and these assumptions make it very alluring to us, and it blinds us to the selfishness that is inherent in this earthly wisdom. I think there's three things that we make assumptions about. First of all, we believe these things can be easily attained. We believe that these things are things that we deserve. They give us this quick hit of dopamine. We've worked hard. We deserve these things. And we believe that these things ask nothing of us, that we are simply consumers. But in fact, they ask everything of us. We sell our souls to these things, which is the caution. We have an example of that from the Garden of Eden in our creation story found in Scripture. We can see that with the first humans, they were enticed by something that was delightful to them. And they saw this thing, this apple of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they saw that it was easily attained. They could just reach out and grab it. That was the temptation given to them. Just reach out and take it, and you will obtain knowledge. It's not that God didn't want to give the first humans, Adam and Eve, knowledge, but God wanted to give it to them on his timeline at the right time. And they were tempted to receive it on their own timeline. It was easily attained. They were led to believe that they could just have it, that success would come to them, that that apple was described as delight. They were tempted to just reach out and receive it. And they were tempted to believe that it was asking nothing of them. God is asking for a relationship with them in the garden. Reaching out and grabbing this piece of fruit asks nothing of them, but of course it asks everything of them, because their relationship with one another, their relationship with all of creation, and their relationship with God is broken. And as James says, when we sell ourselves out to earthly wisdom, we invite all sorts of disorder and every evil practice. So when the first humans reached out and received this thing that was delightful and tempting to them, they invited into the world chaos and disorder. So likewise, when we pursue our own selfish ambitions, whether it be pleasure, whether it be success, whether it be stature, we inevitably create chaos and confusion. We invite these things into our world. When I arrived here on the island last fall, one of the first things I noticed that was opening up again was the racing and the marathon. The PEI marathon was being run for the first time in 2 or 3 years. And I thought to myself, I want to do that. I want to run the PEI marathon. It looks beautiful. Starting up at Berkeley Beach, running along the water, running down into Charlottetown. I love the idea of a point-to-point marathon. And when I reflected on it, I thought, wait a second. This is a bit of a selfish pursuit. For me, at this time in my life, to run this marathon, I would be putting my other relationships at risk. I would be taking time away from my family. I would be spending time in training when I could be doing other projects that we as a family have said we want to do, or other adventures that we as a family want to do. Even if I got up early in the morning and did my long training in the middle of the summer, I'd come home at 9 o'clock in the morning and I'd be a waste for the rest of the day. I would be of no use. It would be a selfish pursuit for me to do that. Does that mean I can never run a marathon? Maybe in some day at the right time I can. But for me to have done that now, or to have said, I'm going to spend my first summer here, with that pursuit would be selfish. It would be something that I could attain, or it could be something I could convince myself that I deserve, but it would be selfish. It would be inherently selfish. It would be earthly wisdom to believe that this is something that I can do. So when James warns us against the image of the good life found in earthly wisdom, he also gives us images of what the real good life looks like, the good life that is informed by heavenly wisdom. And so if you look down at verse 17, he gives us a very full list. And he says, first of all, the good life that comes from heavenly wisdom is pure. It is ethical. It is right. It is born or embedded in ethical wisdom. And it's blameless in that way. It is also considerate. It doesn't abuse positions of power. It is submissive in contrast to selfish ambition. Because we are existing in relationships with one another, we mutually submit to one another rather than pursuing our own selfish ambitions. It is merciful and bears good fruit. So in contrast to creating strife and envy, it produces good fruit in our relationships. It is impartial, meaning that it doesn't judge other people. When we start pursuing earthly wisdom, we easily can find ourselves judging one another, judging others, because we're trying to potentially make ourselves look better, produce a better outcome for ourselves. We become judgmental. And it is sincere. It does not contain hypocrisy. It does not say one thing and do the other. And as one commentator states, a believer who consistently characterizes these virtues would truly impact the world for good. A believer who let me just repeat this, who consistently characterizes these virtues would truly impact the world for good. And perhaps we could say that the best word to describe this good life, as laid out by James, is the word shalom. A Christian philosopher, James K.A. Smith, describes shalom as the biblical shorthand for the good life. Shalom, the word meaning peace, this beautiful, rich word found in the Hebrew scriptures meaning peace, is biblical good hand for the good life. Biblical good shorthand for the good life. You caught that, didn't you? Biblical shorthand for the good life. And the biblical narrative helps us imagine this good life. We've already looked at, described the creation account, the picture of Adam and Eve living in perfect relationship with God, living in perfect harmony with creation, and in perfect relationship with one another. That is the good life. The prophet Isaiah gives us this beautiful picture of the good life when he describes swords being beaten into plowshares, when he describes tools of destruction being turned into tools of productivity, tools of flourishing. This is the picture of the good life. In fact, I think I've got this, I've kept this for many years. This is a page on a calendar from Amnesty International that I had on my wall many years ago. And to me, it describes Isaiah 2 and 4. Do you see what it is? This is an artist from the Afghan taking warheads from the Russian military back when Russia was invading Afghanistan and turning them into flower pots. This is a beautiful image of Isaiah 2 and 4, taking tools of destruction, things meant for destruction, and turning them into beauty. This is the good life that the biblical narrative describes for us. Mary's song, which we look at during Advent, Mary, in praise to God, sings words like, the poor are exalted and the hungry are filled. And then the book of Revelation. Someone yesterday at the barbecue said we should be preaching from Revelation. Well, here it is for you. The picture that Revelation gives us of the good life is this picture of God dwelling in our midst, wiping away all of our tears, where there is no more death because death has been conquered. The biblical picture of the good life is found from the beginning to the end. This is the world that God desires for us. This is the life that God desires for us. So if this is the picture of the good life, the biblical picture of the good life, how is it that we as Christians, how then do we as Christians live in this world? How do we live according to the good life? Well, I want to borrow from a guy named Andy Crouch. Andy Crouch is a theologian from the U.S. who works with entrepreneurs. And he helps entrepreneurs to imagine how they, in starting up their businesses or repurposing their businesses or building their businesses, can think kingdomly, can think about even the good life, how they can create the good life for the people who they are, by using their businesses. And he would say that businesses can operate on 3 levels. He would say that businesses can be, first of all, exploitative, they can be ethical, or they can be redemptive. Let me give you an illustration of this. Okay, so I'm just making this one up, but I'm trying to imagine to help us understand what this would be. In North America, Who do we think of as being the most exploitative when it comes to business? Sadly, it's the used car dealer. And I'm sorry, apologies to you if you're a used car dealer. And I know that there are ethical used car dealers out there. I've dealt with some in my life, and I'm thankful for them. But the image of the used car dealer is that they are unethical. My oldest daughter is in Edmonton. I think her car is going to die. I'm nervous for her. Where is she going to go buy a used car? I want to be with her to make sure this person who is vulnerable because of her lack of knowledge, I'm worried that she's going to be taken advantage of. So in an exploitative environment, it is a I win, you lose transaction. I, the used car salesman, win. I have all the knowledge, you lose. In an ethical work environment, it would be a used car dealer who is ethical in his dealing with his customers. I dealt with one for a few years when I lived in Ontario. His name was Brian. His business was called Good Cars Only. Everybody knew Brian was ethical, that he would not sell you a car that you didn't need. So he would try and get to know you a little bit. And then he would sell you the car. He would say, maybe not that one, this one. Redemptive entrepreneurship would say, it's not just about being ethical, but it's taking an unethical system or structure or way of doing business and totally turning it around. So again, I'm doing this sort of thought experiment. How would that work with our illustration? It might be a used car dealer who says, it's not about putting my employees on commission and getting them to go out and be motivated by money, but I'm going to put them on salary. Their job is not going to be about just making as much money as they can by selling the best car they can or the most expensive car they can. Their job is going to be to educate the consumer so that they feel empowered to make the right decision for the car that they want. Thought experiment. That's kind of my idea. But that's helping us understand, what does redemptive entrepreneurship look like? Well, even that, I think we can take that framework that Andy Crouch gives us, because he says it's 3 ways to work and to live, and we can apply that to our own lives. How do we treat, and so we can start to ask ourselves in our own personal lives, how do we treat those in our lives who are generous to us? Do we exploit their generosity, or do we find ways to return the benefit? Do we find ways to be appropriately thankful? Do we treat them like our personal vending machines, or do we exploit that generosity? And I think this is actually this reality that sometimes generosity gets exploited is the reason and is the cause behind a major issue that we see in our society of elder abuse, where adult children are stealing money from their parents. They see their parents' vulnerability, potentially their generosity, and they steal from them. How do we do things differently? Not exploitatively, not just ethically, but redemptively. Do we redeem these relationships that we have? Do we live in a world where we are seeking to redeem things and do things differently? When someone spends time listening to us, do we turn around and ask that person, how are you? I worry that in some ways in our world we've lost the art of conversation, and we forget to ask the person who gives us their time and their energy by listening to us, asking them back, how are you doing? Turning that around, redeeming that relationship. Well, James ends this passage by calling us to be peacemakers. He calls us to be peacemakers, peacemakers who sow on peace, reap a harvest of righteousness, he said. And perhaps it's as peacemakers that we move from exploitive to redemptive relationships in all our relationships with our families, our relationships within our churches, our relationships within our communities. When we treat one another with respect, when we sacrificially serve one another, we are sowing seeds of peace. This image that he gives to us, sowing seeds of peace. So if we could close just by going back to Andy Crouch once again. Andy Crouch, in his new book, talks about what he calls canopies of trust. And a canopy of trust is a place where promises are made and kept. Under a canopy of trust, people feel safe and cared for. Under a canopy of trust, people are not judged and evaluated. And under a canopy of trust, peace is the goal, and righteousness And what do we mean by righteousness again? We mean right relationships. Peace, under a canopy of trust, peace is the goal, and right relationships are restored. This is the image of the good life that James has for us. And so we close by asking ourselves, does this sound like a life worth living? Does this sound like the life that we want to live? The good life where we are seeking to build relationships of trust, a canopy of trust within our families, within our churches, within our community? Well, I hope so, because that's the life that Jesus is calling us into. And to remind us of that, of what Jesus has done for us and the relationship that he has established for us and has invited us into, I'm going to ask Guy to come up and lead us in communion this morning.